Hey everyone, this is Randall and welcome back to the Imperial Minis channel. This video is part 2 of our series covering the new Bolton mini faction. In our first video, we reviewed the Bolton Commander Tactics cards and discussed each commander's flavor. In this video, we'll discuss some list building options for the 3 Bolton commanders. I'll show 2 lists for each commander and discuss what each list is trying to accomplish. The first list will be pretty standard, looking to lean on the strengths of that particular commander. The second list for each commander will be a bit more of a wild card list. The second list might not work at all on the table, but in theory it looks interesting to me. Usually good lists can be found somewhere in the space between safe lists and ridiculous lists, so hopefully you can use the list building ideas described in this video to calibrate your own halfway decent list. I won't be reviewing the Bolton Tactics deck or the Commander's Tactics decks in any detail in this video, since I reviewed the Commander cards in my last video, and a video from another community content creator discusses the base Tactics deck. Please see the video description for links to those videos if you're interested. Before we get started with the Bolton Commander lists, I want to quickly run through the NCU options available to the Bolton players. There are 5 NCUs total to choose from, and 4 of them are brand new. Let's first take a look at the 4-point NCUs, of which there are 4. So here we have the 4-point NCUs. Going from left to right, we have RAMSAY Snow, who is an influence NCU and gives the unit's melee attacks fueled by slaughter. I think this is a pretty good NCU. Fueled by slaughter is a good ability to have for to help with sustain. Greyjoy players will be familiar with it, and it's something that you can toss onto a unit that you expect to get beaten up a bit in that round, or if a unit is somewhat depleted and you think you can maybe finish off a unit or drop it down a couple of ranks. You can throw this on them, and this will help them heal. Our second NCU is ROOSE Bolton. This NCU is identical to the neutral ROOSE Bolton NCU. He starts the game off with 3 order tokens, and with those order tokens you can panic a unit every time ROOSE activates. So even if ROOSE has to pass, so let's say tactics board, there's 6 NCUs total. If you have to pass with ROOSE, you can still activate him early, use one of his order tokens, and then pass with him, so you don't lose the activation. So you'll still be able to get some value out of ROOSE, even if he doesn't take a board position. And if he does take a tactics board zone, and it's a zone you don't really care for the effect of, you can always replace it and make a unit take a panic test, which in the Bolton faction is something you're going to want your enemy's units to do quite often, because oftentimes you're going to have some kind of panic modifier, or a unit failing a panic test will trigger something else for you, like healing with tactics cards or something else like that. Waldefrey is the 3rd NCU, and she's a bit like a Bolton version of Shira Errol from Baratheon, or a little bit like Hizdar Zolorak from Targaryens, in that whenever she takes a particular zone, you get an additional effect based on which zone you take. So if you take the crown, you can weaken an enemy unit. If she takes the tactic zone, you can replace that zone's effect with she can fish for a commander's tactic card from your discard pile or your tactics deck. And if she takes the wealth zone, you can choose to not remove a condition token and then heal +1 wound. So potentially healing 4 wounds off the wealth zone. Her tactics zone ability, zone replace ability, is what a lot of folks are focusing on here. I think it's kind of so-so, actually. If it was searching your tactics deck or discard pile for any tactics card, I'd say it would be a little bit more powerful. But it only allows you to search for Commander's tactics cards. And while Boltons have some good Commander's tactics cards, none of them are like game-winning cards. None of them are super critical to have. They're all kind of nice to haves. Some of them will set up some fun or powerful attacks, but I don't consider her ability to be something that's going to be game-winning. I think, to me, she's kind of she's the most filler of the NCUs that we have. I know she has a few different effects, but to me, I work her into a list when I have only 4 points left for an NCU rather than 5 points. We'll get to the 5-point NCU here in just a moment. And the 4th 4-point NCU is Tybald. And there's been a lot of discussion about Tybald since we since he was revealed. I'm going to actually talk a bit in more detail about Tybald in just a moment, so I won't read his card off and discuss him quite yet. Now we have one 5-point NCU, and that is Jane Poole. So she has two effects. First off, she has an influence. So her influence is the unit gains +2 to morale test rolls, which doesn't sound very exciting, but is actually a pretty good survival influence ability. So this is 2 out of 5 of our NCUs that have an influence ability, and both of them make the unit more survivable. So Ramsay Snow heals the unit, and Jane Poole straight up is will prevent them from taking more damage. So Jane Poole, you can look at her as being able to take some of our lowest morale units, like Dreadfort Spearmen or Cutthroats, who have a 7-up morale, which is pretty poor, and turning them into a 5+ morale save. So 5+ is considered to be pretty solid morale. That's what most Night's Watch units have. Dothraki have 5-up. 5-up is considered really solid. So Jane Poole, her influence effect can turn the worst Bolton morale into solid Bolton morale. So even though she has 5 points, I think she's a pretty solid pick. But the reason for her being 5 points is her second ability, which is once per game. At the start of any round, you may have your opponent gain control of Jane until the end of the round. If you do, you become first player. Jane cannot influence a unit that round. So on your opponent's side, you give your opponent Jane Poole, but she can no longer give a unit +2 morale for that round. So she just becomes a blank NCU for your opponent, essentially. If your opponent already has 3 NCUs, chances are this isn't going to help them on the tactics board at all. This is going to be another activation for them to just pass with, basically. If your opponent only has 2 NCUs, then you're potentially giving your opponent kind of command of the tactics board. But the trade-off here is that you're basically stealing first player from the opponent. So with this ability, you can really go first twice in a row. You can be first player twice in a row. So let's say you go first and you're first player in round 3, and at the end of round 3, there's the board state is pretty precarious for you, and you really wish you could go first in the next round and maybe finish off an enemy unit before they can heal, or just do something, or save one of your units. You can use her once per game ability to steal first player, and then go first in round 4. It means in round 5, first player will go back to the other player, but situationally, this can be very powerful. And one question about this, though, that I haven't seen asked is how this would interact with like secret mission objectives. So you have objective or mission number 11, I think it is, where if you have fewer victory points than the opponent, you gain 1 victory point and become first player. So usually, I believe you flip those cards before the round begins, before any start of round effects begin. So potentially, your opponent, you could be up on points. Your opponent could flip that card, gain 1 point, and become first player. And then you could, at the start of the round, when you resolve any start of round effects, you could steal first player back from that player. I'm not certain on the timing of that, but if that's true, then that could be a way of kind of taking control back from the opponent when they play that pretty powerful mission card. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at Tybald. There's been a lot of controversy about Tybald since he was revealed. Some questions about how he works, and the developers even updated the FAQ to kind of weigh in on whether he works the way some people were thinking he works. But first we'll just read his card. So he has this Deceitful Envoy. He begins the game with 2 order tokens on him. Each time an enemy NCU activates, you may remove 1 order token from Tybald. If you do, target 1 zone. If that NCU claims that zone, after resolving that zone's effect, 1 enemy combat unit becomes vulnerable. If the NCU does not claim that zone this turn, at the end of the turn, Tybald claims that zone. So it's not the vulnerable token that makes Tybald interesting, it's that last sentence, that if the NCU does not claim the zone that you've identified at the end of the turn, Tybald claims that zone. So we're going to kind of discuss how this is supposed to work in practice, or at least how I see it working. We haven't seen the game, we haven't seen the faction out in the wild really yet. It hasn't gone through a tournament. There hasn't been anybody ruling on how he interacts with the tactics board, but based on the developers' feedback and kind of all of the Discord litigation over Tybald, this is how I see him interacting with the tactics board. So at first, some people were saying that before Tybald activated and took a tactics board position, while he was just sitting on the side of the table, you could potentially use one of his order tokens, and from the order token place him on the zone, on the tactics board before he activated, and then you would then be able to activate him again for his actual activation and move him somewhere else. I thought this always sounded a little fishy, but the devs weighed in on it and shot that down with this new errata here. So it says, for non-combat unit activations, NCUs that are already on the tactics board may not activate. So you can use one of Tybald's order tokens to pick a zone, and if the enemy NCU doesn't claim that zone, you can drop him on that zone and resolve that zone's effect. But if you do that, Tybald is done. So he won't be able to activate and do anything else after that. You could still do this, that it would be kind of burning one of your activations, but it would allow you to, let's say you marked a zone that, let's say you wanted swords. You marked something else, or you marked the sword, and for whatever reason, the enemy NCU didn't take the sword. Tybald would then take the sword, and you could do an attack, and then after that, you would be able to have your actual turn, your actual activation. But let's look at what I think and what most people think is the more powerful and useful way to use Tybald. So here we have a situation where, let's say this is top of the round. This is top of round 2, let's say, and you lead off the round by activating Tybald and dropping him on the combat zone. So you drop him on the sword, and you attack with one of your units, do some damage to the enemy, and then the turn goes to your enemy. And your enemy, or the opponent, activates Catelyn Stark, their NCU. So now you as the Tybald player can think to yourself, well, they just activated their NCU, so maybe I want to use one of my orders here so that I can have Tybald move. So let's see how that's going to work. So here's how that works. You use one of his orders, and the Tybald player thinks that Catelyn might drop herself onto the wealth zone to maybe heal some of that damage you just did with the sword zone. You think maybe she'll take the horse to retreat or maneuver something around. Maybe she'll take the old reliable tactic zone to draw some cards and put out a condition token. But you think Catelyn probably doesn't want the crown zone. It's generally the weakest zone that people aren't really all that concerned about, unless you really need to control that zone in particular. So what Tybald is going to do is when Catelyn activates, as long as the player doesn't say, I activate Catelyn and I put her on the wealth zone immediately, it's always good practice when you have an NCU with this kind of tactics board interaction to tell them ahead of time, hey, look, I've got Tybald here. Whenever you activate an NCU, just, if you don't mind, just say, I'm activating Catelyn, and wait for me to give you the thumbs up to declare where you're going to go with them. Because if the player already tells you where they're going to go in the same breath that they're activating Catelyn, it kind of screws up the timing here. But let's say they do that they say, I'm going to activate Catelyn. They give you the opportunity to speak. And now you say, okay, I'm going to use one of my orders for Tybald, and I will select the crown zone. So what that tells the Catelyn player is that Catelyn can take that zone. So Catelyn can take the crown zone. But if she does, one of her units, one of that player's units, is going to become vulnerable. But if Catelyn doesn't care about that, or Catelyn decides, you know what, I know what Tybald is going to do, but I really need to heal one of my units, so I'm going to drop myself on the wealth zone instead. So the Catelyn player drops themselves on the wealth zone, not the crown. this allows Tybald to move off of the crown onto the crown zone. And since the wording on Tybald's card said he claims that zone, now Tybald gets to resolve the effect of that crown zone. So in the case of Boltons, that isn't such a bad thing, especially since you can do a panic test and maybe trigger some other effects off of that. And now, most importantly, Tybald has evacuated the combat zone, and the Catlin player's turn is now over, and the turn now goes back to you. So you, as the Bolton player, are now looking at a tactics zone where the combat zone is wide open again. So Tybald, in this situation, allows you to essentially take the combat zone twice. Now, it is entirely possible that earlier in this process, when you mark the crown zone as the zone Tybald is going to mark, that the other player says, well, you know what, I know what you're up to. I've seen this happen before, or I've heard about this, so I'm just going to take the crown zone then. I'm not going to take the wealth zone or the tactic zone or the maneuver zone. All right, I'm just going to take the crown zone, and I'll take one vulnerable token. So the vulnerable token is fine. It's not really why you bring Tybald, but even in this situation, you've changed what the other player did. So their intention was to take the wealth zone, heal up one of their units, or get some extra cards, or retreat, or maneuver. So you basically just dictated what they could do, and they went along with it. So it's obviously best if the player doesn't play ball, and you get to jump to another board zone and open up the combat zone again. But even if they don't, you've dictated where they go, what they do, and now the zone that they wanted, they don't get to take anymore, and now you could take that the next round, or the next turn if you want. Now let's look at a powerful combo of Jane Poole and Tybald. So let's say it was round 2, you were first player, you did the Tybald shenanigans of leading off the round by taking the combat zone, popping one of his orders on the opponent's first turn to evacuate the crown or the combat zone. Then you took the combat zone again with one of your other NCUs, and then that round unfolded as it did, and now you move into the next round. So in the next round, which will be round 3, your opponent is first player. Well, now you can take Jane Poole if you wanted to, and use your once per game ability at the start of the round, and now you can take first player. And now you can do this whole Tybald song and dance all over again. So now that you're first player again, you can drop Tybald right back on that combat zone. And now the opponent is going to activate one of their NCUs again. And now you're going to give them the same dilemma of, I'm going to mark the crown zone, or maybe you mark something else, but you mark something that you know they don't want, or that's not going to help them. Let's just say you mark the crown zone again, you burn Tybald's second order, and let's say the player does the same thing. They want to heal, or they feel they really need to heal, or they really need to fish for a particular tactics card. So they ignore the crown zone. They drop themselves back on the wealth zone or wherever. And now Tybald jumps off of the combat zone and onto the crown. And now you can do a double attack again. Now all this is assuming that the opponent plays ball and does what you want them to do. But as I explained, even if they don't do what you want them to do, you've dictated which zone they're taking. So they aren't doing what they had originally intended to do, and you're having an effect on them, on their gameplay. So obviously taking the combat zone twice in a round is the ideal situation. But even if you're dictating where the enemy NCU goes, that in and of itself is a bit of a win. Okay, so now we'll look at some commander lists. We'll start off by looking at ROOSE Bolton lists. First, here's a quick look at his tactics cards to refresh your memory. I think ROOSE is the most well-rounded of the commanders, giving the player more strategic choices than just pure aggro options. He also allows the player to take RAMSAY as either an NCU or attachment, and allows the player to take the unit attachment version of STEELSHANKS, whose Vassal ability synergizes with ROOSE's Seeing Their Flaws card. You can, of course, take STEELSHANKS as an attachment if you're playing with RAMSAY, but the Vassal ability is completely wasted unless you're running ROOSE. So here's list number 1. It's got double Blackguard, one with ROOSE Bolton in it, one with Grunt, who's one of the Bastard's boys, It's got a unit of dogs with STEELSHANKS in it, and a unit of Dreadfort archers with Sour Allen. On the NCU side, we've got Tybald, Ramsay Snow, and Jane Poole. So what does this list want to do? So it has a pretty beefy front line. So 2 Blackguard on the front line are pretty tanky with a 3+ armor save. They have a 6+ morale, which is kind of average, but you do have Jane Poole to drop onto one of them to bring their morale save to a 4+. You've also got Ramsay Snow. If you get desperate, you can throw him on one of them to help heal, but you're probably going to want to be using Ramsay's influence on your dogs because they're just so fragile at a 6+ save. And one of the Blackguard has Grunt in him, so he makes them even tankier, giving them resilience. So if they take a really big hit in one of the turns of each round, he can help save more dice fails than they would have otherwise. And kind of the secret sauce of this list is STEELSHANKS going into the dogs. So anytime one of your units in the front line gets attacked, you can pop Sentinel on STEELSHANKS and use that to kind of help maneuver those dogs around to the flank, and then attack into one of the flanks. And then with STEELSHANKS there, using Vassal, he can make use of ROOSE's Seeing Their Flaws card, so that he can also benefit from removing abilities from the units that he's attacking. And then Sour Allen and the Archers is kind of a pretty standard Bolton pick. You're going to see that in a lot of lists just because of how powerful those attack abilities are to give to Archers. And so it's something you'll be seeing a lot in Bolton lists. So here's my ROOSE wildcard list. So this is a double Bastard Girls list. And full disclosure, I do not even own two of this unit. I only own one of them, so this is purely hypothetical. I probably won't be buying 2 of them, even though I do love the meme factor of taking half of my army being dogs. But yeah, this army, it's got ROOSE in one of them and STEELSHANKS in the other of them. And then it's got a front line of Blackguard with a Dreadfort Captain and Dreadfort Spearman with Grunt. And then the same NCU lineup of Tybald, Ramsay, and Jane Poole. So this list, it has a dog goon squad. So the dogs can kind of run around together, gooning stuff, or you can have one on each flank, swinging around and attacking stuff. If they're separated from each other, then you're not going to probably be making much use out of the Vassal ability of Seeing Their Flaws with STEELSHANKS if he's not attacking the same thing that ROOSE is. But then on your front line, you've got the Blackguard with a Dreadfort Captain to hopefully be healing them up as they're as enemies they're engaged with are failing panic tests. And then the Dreadfort Spearmen, who are not the tankiest unit out there, with a 4+ save and a 7+ morale. Hopefully with Grunt, they'll be able to at least take one punch to the face like a champ every round. Alright, now moving on to Ramsay Snow. Here are his tactics cards to refamiliarize yourself with what he's got. And then moving on to his first list. We have Dreadfort Spearmen with Ramsay Snow Commander in them. We've got the Sour Allen Archers. And we have Bolton Bastard Girls with Ben Bones, who's a free attachment in them. And then we have 2 units of Cutthroats. And on the NCU side, we have Tybald, ROOSE Bolton, and Walda Frey. So this list is really wide. So it's an 8 activation list, which is as wide as you can get for Boltons right now. The Cutthroats, so one thing holding it back a little bit here is the Cutthroats aren't a good target for Ramsay's Opportunist tactics card, since they both, the Cutthroats naturally have benefits against units that haven't activated yet, and the Opportunist tactics card, some of the benefits of that card are already present on the Cutthroats. So that's one of Ramsay's tactics cards that aren't really a good good candidate for use on the cutthroats, so you're going to lose a little bit of value there. And the Spearman unit here is a pretty nasty unit to attack, since it has Set for Charge and Horrific Visage in it. But that fact might just mean that they get ignored. And then Fat Walda is here due to points. I have 4 points for the last NCU. If I had 5, I probably would have brought Jane Poole to make one of the cutthroats a little more durable, or make the Spearman a little more durable. But those cutthroats are essentially just a suicide squad. So, they're there to just wreak some havoc, do some damage, and probably get killed in the first couple of rounds. Then hopefully what you've got left on the table is enough to win the game. So the second RAMSAY list is my kind of wild card pick. This one has double Flayed Men. It has RAMSAY in Bolton Bastard Girls. And then it has a unit of the Dreadfort Spearmen with Grunt. On the NCU side, it's got the same lineup of NCUs as the previous list. And this list is it's a very maneuverable list. So we've got the 2 Flayed Men who can either both take one flank or split off. And then the Bastard Girls are very maneuverable themselves. The Spearmen can either camp on an objective the whole game, or they can hold the line for a while, since they do have Grunt in them. And the Flayed Men also, they're a 3-up save. They're no slouch in melee. They can tank if needed. They also benefit from the Opportunist Tactics card and Spoils and Flesh, which is the Fueled by Slaughter on a stick tactics card. RAMSAY's unit is fragile, but it's not wanting to be in combat alone, so you want RAMSAY to kind of pile in with the Flayed Men. And RAMSAY has Horrific Visage on him, so enemies attacking his unit, even though his unit is very fragile, units attacking his unit will be forced to take a panic test for their trouble. Alright, and last but certainly not least, we have STEELSHANKS Walton. Here is his commander attachment card and tactics cards to refresh your memory. So here's our first list for STEELSHANKS. It has STEELSHANKS in Blackguard. It has a unit of dogs with Grunt to make them a lot more durable, at least for the first punch to the face that they take. And then the predictable unit of Sour Allen Archers, and then a unit of Flayed Men. And then we've got 4-point NCUs, Tybald, RAMSAY, and ROOSE. So in this list, we've got 2 fast-moving units that you're going to want to be maneuvering around the flanks with. That's where STEELSHANKS Price of Fear card comes into play. You're going to want to use the dogs and the Flayed Men to get those maneuvers off with. RAMSAY can help to keep the Blackguard alive, or you can use them to help keep those dogs alive. So between having Grunt on them to take a big punch to the face every round with resilience, and RAMSAY, you could potentially keep those dogs a lot healthier than you are used to seeing them in games. And then those Blackguard are there just to kind of hold the line. They're going to be taking auto wounds from the Sour Allen Archers, most likely. But this list is all about making the most of those maneuver elements in your army, the dogs and those Flayed Men. So here's our second list. You can see we have kind of a tanky front line, no Sour Allen Archers, and but then the same 2 kind of deep, like, damage dealing maneuver units, but a little bit different. So we've got our Dreadfort Spearmen with STEELSHANKS in them. We've got some Blackguard with Grunt. We have a unit of Flayed Men, and we have the Bolton Bastard Girls with Sour Allen. So the Sour Allen Bolton Bastard Girls is what kind of makes this the wild card list. So looking at the list here, the spears are there to kind of bait out panic test fails. If you look at STEELSHANKS' commander attachment, if his unit fails a panic test, then any enemy units in short range take a panic token. Just like the previous list, our maneuver elements are going to want to make use of Price of Fear, tactics card Price of Fear, to maneuver around the flanks. possibly supporting each other in a little goon squad. And the dogs with Sour Allen are just kind of going like balls to the walls damage, do or die mode here. Because Sour Allen is going to do 2 wounds to them if they don't kill an enemy rank, but Sour Allen just kind of turns these guys into a Scud missile. One extra tricky thing with Sour Allen here is that if you intend to make use of the charging volley ability of the Bolton Bastard Girls, and why wouldn't you, you have to keep in mind that Sour Allen's ability is going to trigger on both the ranged attack and then the melee attack. So potentially if you're rolling really poorly or your opponent is rolling really well and you don't destroy an enemy rank on the first attack, which is entirely possible since the ranged attack is only 4 dice, you're going to take 2 wounds. And then if you charge in and you still don't completely remove a rank, you're going to take 2 more wounds. So potentially if you roll really badly or your opponent rolls well or has some really beefy armor, you might just charge into them and delete an entire rank of your unit without really doing much to the enemy. So it's kind of a high risk reward thing to throw Sour Allen into those dogs. But on the NCU side, we do have the kind of sustain NCUs there of Ramsay Snow, Jane Poole. Not that the dogs necessarily need Jane Poole as an influence since they already are at a 5-up. Ramsay Snow is probably a good candidate for influencing the dogs, and Jane Poole will be much better used on one of your frontline units like the Blackguard with Grunt, because your frontline is gonna probably be taking a beating. If everything is going well for you, your front line is taking a beating while your maneuver units are doing damage. So that's it for our army list review for Boltons. I know there are probably much better lists out there. If somebody has a really great list that they want to share in the comments or have a suggestion on how to make any of these lists better, by all means, drop your advice in the comments section. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to part 2 of my Bolton mini faction series. That's going to do it for our card and list reviews. Our final Bolton video will be an Army Showcase video where I show some of my painted Bolton units that I've prepared in the lead up to this Bolton faction release. These will be the original neutral Boltons, since I don't have my hands on the new minis as of the time of recording this video. While I show the minis and the completed painted units, I'll talk a bit about how I painted them, which colors I chose, and anything else I think will be interesting. And if you haven't already, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, this is Randall, signing off.